as a disclaimer, so we need to have disclaimers nowadays. I'm not a GDPR expert, I'm not a data scientist. I'm just someone who's interested with the social of the internet and its impact on our lives, whether it's, like privacy, consideration we need to keep in mind when we talk about Internet of Things, big data, and such. And I've got a lot of people asking me, like, why this topic? It's like, how did it came? Like, that was the weirdest submission during the SUGCON. And I have two reasons for that. First one is a shout out to Jason Sanseer's session last symposium about who watches the watchers. And if you watch that one, it's a great one. It's nice that Sitecore allows us to talk about that. So right after the symposium was like, okay, it's about time to talk about something other than technical aspect of the technology we're working with on a daily basis. The second reason is that I think most of you guys, last year, we spent like most of our clients' budgets trying to implement GDPR, right? Maybe it's more into the European and UK, but actually we did spend a considerable amount of time thinking about what is the implication of GDPR and the new laws of privacy on our clients' implementations and so forth. So when we think about it, the things about privacy and the rights of information, nothing of this is new. The realization of that into laws and regulations happened recently. So if it's happened to data, eventually it's gonna keep up with everything else, such as machine learning, AI, and this kind of stuff. So let me start by telling a story. And in this story, you're driving your friend's car. It's 80 miles per hour. At the end of the road, we have 5 workers. You lost your brakes, so eventually you're gonna end up killing the 5. You take a look at your left, then there's an alternative road. At the end of the road, you have 1 worker there. What would you choose? Would you keep, how many of you guys would kill the 5 people? Like, it's a mechanical error, I can't do anything about that. So how many of you would go with that? 1, 2, good. How many of you guys would go with killing only 1? All right, so as expected, majority of people would go with an option that causes less harm to people, right? 5 against 1. Let's add a twist to that and say, now you are on top of the bridge, you are the onlooker, you're looking at your friend's car again, strolling down the road, and to your right, there's this huge guy leaning down on the bridge. All you need to give them a shovel. And then if they fall down, they're gonna stop the car, nobody gonna die. But the poor guy we will lose the poor guy. So how many of you guys would choose also to kill 1 person, but he's that huge guy? Any hands? No? You? All right, Corey gonna kill him. All right, so for the majority of people, gonna look at that. Okay, what are the consequences of my actions, right? In both cases, we're killing 1 person. In the first scenario, it's not something we are controlling. We are in a situation where you gotta do what you gotta do, right? In the second situation, you are the one who's causing the death. So this is how human beings think. All right. Fast forward, it's 2019, maybe a couple of years before. Now we're talking about autonomous cars. Again, you're in your friend's autonomous car. I don't know why you still can't buy a car, but you're using his car. And we're gonna take a look about another scenario, which we call, I'm not gonna call it, but let's say it's the pedestrian scenario. In this case, you're at the walking, like pedestrian walk, and the car brake for some reason, and the car need to choose whether to save the passenger, whether to kill any one of the workers. And now, excuse me if I'm gonna say object, I'm gonna refer to humans as object, but the car needs to choose between killing a human being or killing an animal. That human being, is it gonna be a male, gonna be a female? Is it gonna be like a wealthy person or a poor guy? So now, drivers at the first scenario, and that's what we call the trolley problem, it's not about making the right choice. You're having to choose between two bad scenarios, right? But in the second case of autonomous cars or self-driving cars, you are programming, these cars are programmed in advance, right, to make a choice, what to do, which priority we're gonna take. So who's gonna make that decision? Is it manufacturers? Is it businesses who are gonna choose this over that? So these are some of the thinking that's happening. However, if you look at the machine learning decision making and this stuff, if we take a closer look from a technical perspective, it's not a white or a black choice. There's no bit in the entire process that say, okay, switch between 0 and 1, right? It's a more comprehensive process where there's going to be trained, I forget the word. It's going to be a trained model, an optimized model, an inference engine. So it's more of a complex scenario. But to people out there, and excuse me if I say it's for people who choose to go with Brexit, we're going to be voting on these kind of cases, right? They would look at that and say, like, if you search and look at artificial intelligence, like, robots going to take over our jobs, we're going to be jobless very soon, what's going to happen to us next as more and more is going into machines? These decisions are made by someone else who take a look at that, won't understand a thing, and then asks a question, what's going to happen to us? And for us developers, when we look at that, even from an ethical perspective, it's not about, you know, is it ethical to have more cars in the road, right? I think we all agree, I don't know if anyone disagrees that maybe cars, auto-driving cars are going to be best drivers than humans. Like, these are not the conversations we're having. We're going to talk about choosing between least two desirable actions. That's what we call an ethical dilemma. So for us, it's not to develop like a good algorithm or a bad algorithm. It's how we can take into consideration all these different factors when we think about it. All right. When we start to look at and search about algorithms and ethics, there's a number of understanding we all need to share. And typically, there's a number of words and terminologies we need to think about. Number one is ethics. So this is one of the terms that continuously are going to be out there when you look at that, which is a set of moral principles that governs a person's behavior or the end result of an action. We have morals, which is the principles that's concerning right or wrong, is it a good behavior or bad behavior. Eventually, with any human interaction, we have bias, which is a prejudice, whether it's in favor of or against a person or a group of people, but that action considered usually unfair. And finally, everything materialized as laws. So we have laws, which is, you know, systems or let's say rules that communities and countries create in order to govern everything, right? So these are the different definitions and terminology that we need to keep in mind whenever we talk about this kind of stuff. I'm going to talk about them eventually during the session. So let me go back and say, like, all of these and the list, these are more of human artifacts, right? It has nothing to do with technology. And with anything human, number one, it's complex. So it's not easy to govern or instrument or to implement. It's contextual. So different countries, different communities can have different interpretation of these values. And it changes over time. So whatever has been acceptable maybe decades ago, now it's not acceptable, or vice versa, right? So let's take a look at another example of how complex humans are in the terms of autonomous cars. So MIT, a couple of years back, did this research, and they wanted to see how people are gonna now have a better understanding in terms of two schools of ethics. The first one is Bentham's utilitarian principle, and in this case, so Bentham says the car should do any action the car is doing should be the minimum harm to other people. So it doesn't matter if I'm killing the passenger or I'm killing the pedestrian, as long as we're talking about less number of harm people. The other one is Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant's principle is about a car simply should not kill. Don't take an action that explicitly gonna end up harming people. So let the car take its course. So for those who killed 5 people, they were into like Immanuel Kant's school of thinking, is like, do not participate in an explicit action that's gonna cause that harm. And they went ahead and they asked people, would you buy a car based on, like an autonomous car based on all of this? The answer was no. Typical human. And when they were asked, okay, what kind of a car would you buy? They said, I want to buy a car that increases my safety, and everyone else should buy a car that minimizes the total harm. So this is how complex, or on a deeper level, how human beings thinks. And they typically think that technical people won't think about this kind of stuff. And hence, you find all of this skepticism about what we are doing, and do we take care of morals when we develop this kind of stuff. All right. I think I clicked next. All right. But any of this is new? Definitely not. So always with technology, it creates pressure on our judgments and values, right? In the 18th century, it was the coal mine revolution, and children were okay to work in coal mines, while this now is unacceptable. Same thing during 1920s. The medical revolution happened. We're talking about cloning. These are the questions that happened around that time, about birth control bills and this kind of stuff. Is that a moral thing or not a moral thing? So technology always evolves in a way that's faster than society can keep up with. And eventually, when society discusses this, laws are going to be written in order to regulate and solidify these things. So why now? So now with artificial intelligence and everything is smart, we can see the impact more clearer and at scale, and no one can deny that. You can come and say, this is an example, let's hope it's going to play, of a smart home device. I think there's no sound. So there's a couple of from Oregon talking with each other, and their smart device picked certain names, summarized the conversation, and emailed that to a friend without them knowing. And Amazon called that unlikely string of events. That's something that happened that's not planned. But that's an example of how deeper, artificial intelligence or smart technologies within our lives, and we're not 100% aware of what's the impact of that. Or maybe on the other side, these manufacturers or technologist people, do they take these things into consideration when they plan and develop this kind of stuff? Not going to do any more advertising for that. All right. So why should we care about that? Definitely there's many reasons for that. Number one, from a legal perspective, we developers, we don't want to set in the place of Facebook or Google answering these questions, right? We don't want to be sued for anything of that. But if you take a look, maybe it varies based on regions and countries, right? Maybe in our countries not that advanced, but in the US and Australia and Europe, you would see that algorithms are making decisions increasingly about us, with us, and for us. They are very powerful and pervasive. They're sometimes the main auxiliary tool or a secondary, and in some scenarios, it's the sole decision maker about things in our lives. So it's actually here. It has materialized a while ago. Nothing of this is new, and we are able to measure and see what is the impact of that. And again, with anything related to human artifacts, there is no right answer for this. There is no simple answer either. Because when we talk about that, we need to talk about what are the trade-offs when we are developing these algorithms or with AI? Who should be in these conversations? Is it the developers? Is it manufacturers? Is it business owners? Is it the public who should be participating in these conversations? And when we are developing like an advanced or a complicated scenario, where are these conversations? Are these conversations happening? How we can define or know that whatever we are building gonna end up to be a dilemma, and if that is actually an ethical dilemma. So there's like, till the end of the session I'll be raising more and more questions, but that's the current situation is about. There's no right answer, there's no simple answer, and there's no consensus about anything. It's just how we can think about the impact of AI algorithms in our lives and how we can take action towards that. All right. To add to that complexity, when we talk about algorithms, not only the moral aspects of it, right? We're talking its impact on economics. We need to calculate the risks that comes by these technologies. And we need to think about regulation and laws that govern our understanding of AI. So how we can end up defining what AI is. And if you guys watched like yesterday's session on Cortex, you will find that, okay, can we simply like say an AI is 1, 2, 3, 4? Is it something we can just go to Wikipedia and pick? There's lots of people would say, okay, it's machine learning. Some people who doesn't know like AI can just say it's machine learning. Someone would say it's deep learning, and like there's different kind of domain that AI covers. But if we think about that, it's more about all these technologies together. So we're talking about sensing and sensors. We're talking about technology and reasoning. We're talking about algorithms. We're talking about data. So when we talk about ethics for something that has a big scale with lots of different components, can we say AI as a big concept is moral? Or can we say the data that we are feeding that is moral? Or can we say the algorithm should be moral? So how we start to, like, get deep down into that, break it into the components, and then say, okay, now we need to take every single component in isolation and talk about that. And an example of AI, it's machine learning, and I just wanted to mention it because this is how many of the non-technical people would think about it. It's this black box that has an input. You feed it like different number of scenarios. It has an output, and somehow a decision is made or a prediction. And from a technical perspective, what you're doing inside the black box, there's an algorithm that you continuously over time tweak, right? Until you reach a point where the prediction that you're getting is the most accurate one. For many, it's like, okay, if we take a deeper look at that black box, what does it mean? How does it impact my life, right? And this is how we mostly like approach that. It's something we don't know how it works, so how we can govern, how we can regulate. All right, the next big question is data. And for us working with Sitecore, I think that is like one of the most sought after information in any customer journey, right? We collect information about them, we track, and we build personalization, customer journey, everything is about data. And with Cortex and personalization, mentioned yesterday as some sort of AI, right? Predictive personalization, content tagging. So Sitecore as a platform, we're going towards more and more automation, although like automation is part of this, and it's much more than that, but in a way or another, we're touching with data. And with data, like if we look at the past 100 years, it's like things change. So things that has been in the past deemed to be evil or bad, now it might be the norm. And I'm not going to talk about criminology as an example. I'm going to talk about it in a bit. Human resources and hiring. If you go through the time, at the beginning, and if you analyze the data, you'll see like it's mostly male, white male, and by history, you see like more acceptance for more females as more professionals and people of color and such. So when you look at that, what you're gonna do once you feed that kind of data sets to your machine learning, are you gonna teach them that it is acceptable to always like hire white men? No offense to anyone in the room, but that's reality. So when you start to train your model into that, so what would you think? Okay, am I going to omit these kind of biases or like discrepancies in data while maintain the integrity of our data set? Is that something we can do? Or if now we're more into hiring more women in different sectors, is it okay for us to inject these data into our data sets so we can have this balanced model that once we feed to these algorithms that are gonna help us do the hiring process, is that also okay? So these are the different trade-offs and questions that again, it's not simple to answer and it's really complicated. All right, so working with data, again, introduces a different number set of questions. How the data being collected? By whom? And why? Under what circumstances? Were there any social contract with these people that we get this information with? An interesting example was, so in Australia, indigenous people, they have been collecting information about them, like huge data since, I think, the 40s and 50s. And recently they wanted to get out with this project where they're gonna identify, okay, how did these people migrate to Australia and get a pattern of that. But back in the days, when this data has been collected, you know, like for research and stuff, it was like knocking on doors, asking them, give me these questions. Nobody understands the concept of consent, right? You would give away your information. And even now, if you go to the bank and they ask you about, okay, by law you have to supply us with all of this information. Take. You won't even read what is in that. Most people would go, okay, in terms of time stuff, I'm gonna provide this information. So by the time that this information has been collected, and now most of these people died, and now maybe we're talking about third and fourth generation existence. So what these data scientists did, they went back to these families again, to their children, and asked them for consent. And said, would you allow us now to use this information as part of our research and understanding of that? It's interesting, only one family rejected to do that, but everyone was open, you know, like for the sake of, you know, doing the research. So the consent, has there been any consent when you acquired this kind of information? What was the expectation when you collected? Have you came with a pre-assumption of where this data gonna put you towards, right? Do you have that predefined mentality? So once you start to analyze this data, does it match my expectation or not? And was it fair? And is it good? And definitely we can come up with even more and more questions around that, but this is just like the thinking when you want to talk about this kind of stuff. Again, with AI is like really a broad space that includes almost everything. With sensor, it was interesting, I didn't know that before, but Wi-Fi waves can detect your movement and can broadcast like what we are doing. Now I talk and I move my hands. If someone like from outside look at me, think I'm fighting or something, but I'm just like, no, this is how I explain things. So basically, did we give any consent for these people to watch us and detect our movements and get more information about that? I think many of us like didn't even know that. I was like, okay. I was like so conscious about my privacy, like until 2016 I owned a smartphone. Because like, I don't want anyone to track what I'm doing or anything, but now I can't. You can't live without having that. So what's the compromise? What's the trade-off we're doing in order to benefit from these kind of technologies, but at the same time, we maintain some modicum of privacy, right? Okay. The most interesting topic that's associated with that is bias. Maybe it's not necessarily talking about from an ethical perspective, but it's humans. And as long as we would like to say we're perfect, we're not. That's reality. And if we are expecting to have these moral algorithms by default, like once I develop that algorithm, the output gonna be really objective, taking my rights into consideration, that's not the case. Because what we are feeding these algorithms are society and community data. And there's always someone in the process, right? There's someone who's collecting this data, there's someone who's cleaning this data, and there's someone who's structuring this data to be injected. How can we guarantee no prejudice has been part of that process? And there's like, even if you just a quick search, you'll find even the basic software, such as in cameras to detect people's faces, they failed as simply because the race is different. The case that was like really intriguing for me, like Jason mentioned last symposium, is like that soap dispenser that person of color or like African American tried to get it to work, it did not. So he took a white sheet of paper in front of the soap dispenser and it worked. It's like really mind-blowing when you start to think and see like how technology out there is almost insanely biased. Another example is like a really well-known system or software in the US that determine for the courtroom for the inmates, would they be achieving parole or not. And what they found is if the algorithm was right, the result was fair. If the algorithm was wrong, people of color has deemed twice not to be granted parole because they predicted they're gonna offend again, although that was not the case. And that's like a running system maybe for 5 years in the judiciary system in the US. And if we take a look, again, like these statistics and numbers, like nothing intentionally like in that, but in high tech, almost 70% of people working in that sector are white males. Almost 7.4 are African Americans, 8% are Hispanic, 14% are Asian Americans. So this is just in the US, and you can imagine the different statistics around the world. And these are who is everyone behind building these kind of artificial intelligence and learning systems. So what can we do about that? There's different things that we can think about when we want to combat bias in society. And it starts by when we design and start to think about these technologies, when we implement it, how we can make sure at least the output we're producing is less biased. It's somehow objective. I know it's hard because everyone comes with this baggage of stuff, but it starts from us. It starts from organizations when during the entire process of implementing this system, if people like adapt this culture of transparency, accountability, and once they spot this kind of biased behavior, they can speak about it. And the most important part is diversity. Because you can't be talking about everyone else without making sure your own house is clean, right? You can't expect an AI algorithm that has been trained on data that comes from society to be better than society, right? Unless you design it to be that way. All right, so my final thoughts would be around where we go from here. By doing just a quick research, there's different ways we can tackle that or start the discussion around that. First thing, we should reach some sort of a consensus about these kind of terms and definitions. And if we fail to do that, at least we can come up with a new terms that everyone can agree on. And then we start, talking about ethics with a more, like in relation to whatever technology we are building. If we fail as human beings to agree that what's okay in my society is not okay in someone else's society or culture, and vice versa. Another thing that's really important is I can't pronounce that word. It's explainability. Okay, so so it's like the white box. If you take that black box, and you want to try to ask someone like, what's happening inside that algorithm? And if you go to that developer who built that or programmed that, can they, in a simple term for the non-technical people, say, this is what it done, this is why we made this decision, this is why we made that decision? So these kind of algorithms should be able to simply to be explained. And the GDPR actually, and although it's not related, but it's good to be mentioned because there's an article in there that stresses the right of explanation. So an entity to explain a specific decision or outcome. And what's good, I know like for many people, GDPR might be good or bad. It's based on your own interpretation. But for the most common scenario, it's about promoting the right of information for people, right? For our customers, the right of protecting these data, to agree on sharing these data. So you will see after the adaptation of GDPR that now we are consciously thinking when we start to develop our systems or solutions, would that violate customers' data or not? Would that violate their privacy or not? So they are increasing the awareness about these kind of rights, and it's really good to consciously think about when we build our systems. The other thing, again, technology is always going to put stress on our values and judgment. And there's always going to be a trade-off. Do we want an algorithm that's very precise and accurate when we do prediction, versus can we ensure fairness and equal treatment as an output? Do we need to increase the personalization and digital solution in comparison to enhancing solidarity and citizenship? Same thing. We need this data, right? We need to collect as much data from our customers to increase the quality of the service we are providing. On the other hand, are we maintaining their privacy? Automation. We're trying to adapt automation to make our lives and customers' lives more efficient. On the other hand, do we promote self-actualization and dignity for these customers? So at the end, anything about ethics or any human artifacts is going to be a trade-off between this or that. It's not about the right thing or the bad thing. It's about what works best for everyone. And finally, we need to build a solid ground of discussing about these things. We shouldn't be conscious, it's like we're afraid to talk about that because that might gonna harm our business, or we're gonna be put in a situation later on where we're gonna be defending our choices in our team, right? We need to be able to establish an environment where we can discuss that. I know these topics, when I started to look at that, like since 2015, people were talking about that. Maybe it's not happening next year. We're going to see laws like GDPR and stuff that's going to be governing AI and machine learning. Maybe it's within 5 years, but we should be an active participants in these conversations. And it's good to be part of the process rather than the one who's catching up with everyone else and trying to do the right thing then. And that's it for me. If you have any questions.
Yep.
All right. Make it easy.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting and informative. Forgive me, I came a little bit late into the room, but I'm also, now that I've heard you speak, I'm curious to hear, like, why do you choose this topic? What motivates you to want to speak about this subject?
So, for many reasons. One reason is that I've seen a talk by Jason St. Cyrs last year during symposium talking about who watches the watchers. So for me, it's like, okay, Sitecore are open to talk about stuff that's not necessarily technical. And I come from a background where I studied human rights. and the rights of information and data and privacy is like the core. So I have that kind of interest. And while working with Sitecore, especially with personalization and analytics, I've always been conscious what I'm doing is right or not. And then I swept everything at the back of my head. I'm not going to worry about it now. But as we are talking about it as like Sitecore as a platform eventually had to keep up with GDPR and these laws, then we need to think about that. So it's something interesting to think about. To help us to be conscious about what we are doing, and hopefully we're doing something good for people. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
I agree.
Thank you.
Obviously,
Boy.
great stuff.
Yeah.
It was interesting, actually. There was a seminar in this same room yesterday afternoon where Rodrigo was using machine learning to do facial recognition
Yes.
to potentially personalize your results in a real store environment and then feed that back into your profile. So therefore, it's there's we're saying in theory we could recognize that somebody's 30 and female or whatever. So there's a kind of an interesting point there. Is that then by default introducing some sort of bias because it's saying you're 30 and female, so therefore you're going to like this? Because he was saying even if we didn't know who you were, we could match your face to similar looking women, if you like. So is it almost impossible to not always end up with a bit of bias?
So it's an interesting point because I spoke about omni-channel between the offline and online last year. And I was like trying to focus, okay, when we do segments and we're matching profiles and customer behavior, we're eventually going to talk sometime about gender. Because when you're going to personalize like a certain line of clothes or anything, you're going to need to know what's that gender or not, right? So in this case, it's not about bias, because the bias is a decision made that's going to affect your life. It's good if we can do all this kind of segmentation and personalization by omitting gender, for example. Start to think about that, by omitting, because there might be, and it happens like a lot in our cultures, like the man would be shopping for his family, so he was going to be looking at children's clothes for his wife, and imagine all the personalization next is going to be female clothes and stuff like that. So we need to be conscious when we do personalization, when we create these segments, to try to go from the general kind of segments to a more specified list of segments where we say, okay, it sounds like they're more interested in this brand or that brand, and we try to bridge the gap by that. Definitely, like facial recognition is a huge plus, and the commerce spectrum, and definitely it can help you feed everything back and build that kind of relationship. It would be nice if it managed to identify all customers and not fail at certain kind of scenarios, but it definitely should be empowering in a way that beyond the technical limitation, how we can leverage it in a way that, I don't know, might not be biased. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for a really interesting topic. So, obviously, this is not only a technical challenge, and you mentioned Sitecore. Obviously, there'll be some machine learning there. Do you think it is responsibility of Sitecore to enforce some kind of ethics considerations, or only supporting it, like GDPR is currently handled?
My personal view is that Sitecore should be aware of this kind of stuff and having that as their core platform direction and principles, right? Because it's everyone part of the community. Sitecore is part of the community, and eventually they're going to be affected if later on they are in the position of Facebook or Google being asked why your product is being used as something that might violate people's privacy or whatever. And maybe it's our responsibility also as implementers to take that into consideration, but definitely having the flexibility, like having in the XConnect, the ability to merge, contacts, and giving us the opportunity to work in ways that not necessarily you're doing an actual tracking, but still delivering quality of work, I think that's something empowering. And we have Sidecore guys here, have Martina and Nick. If any one of you guys want to add to that, but yeah.
I'll just say that one thing that concerns me in the symposium last year is not involved in development. The data science department is looking not just at how customers can build their own data models and personalize on that, but we're looking at building these shared data models that can and shared data collection, right? That customers can then use to personalize based on their business category and so on. And it seems to me like there's almost a conflict between trying to ensure that that model itself isn't biased and people's privacy, right? Because if I want to make sure the model isn't biased, then I need to be collecting more information on the people and the data that's going into that. Am I thinking right that there is some kind of inherent conflict there, or concern, or?
Yeah, I was like conscious not to say that out loud, but thank you for that. Any other questions?
No more questions? Oh, in the back.
Sorry, I just arrived.
Yeah, no worries.
Do you have this shared somewhere that you can?
Yeah, I will definitely. Oh, why it's not clicking? Right, so I won't forget that like last year. I will definitely share this on Twitter and on LinkedIn, and it's going to be available. And most likely, if I have the chance to present this again, other user groups, I would love to do that. So we can share it. This is my Twitter handle, so if you want anything,
Thank you.
we can connect there. Thank you.
We're also recording this, by the way, so
yeah,
that might be...
that's right.
Yep. Any other questions?
No?
Okay. Well, thank you, Ishraq.
Thank you so much. Thank you.